Hi friends, I'm Dr. Andrew Prue. I'm an addictions researcher and best-selling author. Welcome to my series on how to help an addict. The information in this video series comes from my best-selling book, Understanding and Helping an Addict and Keeping Your Sanity. This book is available from Amazon.com, and if you're interested in taking a look, I've included a link in the description below. I practiced as a physician in the ER, hospital, and office settings for 15 years before falling to addiction. I've been in recovery from addiction to alcohol and opioids since September 2016. Since then, I've gone back to school to do my PhD in the Neuropsychology of addiction, and I've dedicated my career to research, writing, and education on matters of addiction. If you'd like to know more of my story, I've included a list of my credentials and a brief outline of my story in the description below. In this video, we'll be talking about why addicts behave the way they do. We'll talk about the addicted brain, the addicted mind, and concurrent mental health disorders, and how these relate to the thought processes and behaviors that we know of as addiction. Then we'll talk about how we can use this information to better understand and help an addicted loved one. And I'll finish with a take-home message. If asked what's the greatest mistake that families and friends make when trying to help an addict loved one, without hesitation I would say this: they go at the problem too hard, they push too hard, and become too involved. They're definitely doing it out of boundless love and caring, but they may be doing it wrong. Our instinct is to try harder when the solution to a problem eludes us. And logic tells us that throwing ourselves more forcefully at the problem and pushing harder will help us beat it. Well, addiction isn't a logical problem. When it comes to addiction, it's much better to act smart than it is to act harder. This is one time that more brains are required and less brawn. The problem with using our brain to help an addict is that addiction doesn't make any sense. It's hard for the mind to wrap itself around addiction because addiction defies logic and understanding. After all, why would anyone keep doing something that's clearly destroying everything that's important to them and is making them miserable? Why don't they just stop? Well, the truth is that addiction makes a lot of sense. Once you understand the specific effects of repeated substance use on the brain, all the bizarre thought processes and the maddening behaviors suddenly make perfect sense. Once we understand addiction, we can use that knowledge to take an approach to helping an addict that's a lot smarter and more effective and requires much less effort, frustration, and personal sacrifice. There really is such a thing as the addicted brain. Thanks to significant innovations in our ability to study the living brain, our understanding of the effects of addictive substances on the brain has advanced considerably over the past 2 decades. Addiction exists simply because addictive substances have a remarkable ability to activate and adulterate key brain structures and functions in a way that propagates substance use and promotes relapse and recovery. Addiction results primarily from the effects of addictive substances on 2 important brain systems: the executive control system and the learning system. Let's look at each of these now. The first part of the brain affected by repeated substance use is the prefrontal cortex, seen here. This is the part of the brain that allows us to engage in higher level thinking, such as reasoning, planning, and decision making. It protects us from harm by providing us with judgment and self-control, and helps us to achieve our short and long-term goals by coordinating our behavior so that they're goal-directed. When the executive control system is adulterated in the addicted brain, it produces a cluster of symptoms. I'll list off some of these symptoms and see if they remind you at all of the addict in your life. Impulsivity, impaired inhibition, untruthfulness and confabulation, poor ability to plan, lack of insight into one's own dysfunctional behaviors, aggression, restlessness, apathy and lack of drive, obsessive or repeated thoughts or actions, knowing-doing dissociation. This is where we undertake unwise decisions despite knowing better. Distractibility and poor concentration, poor decision-making, lack of social awareness, and lack of concern for social rules. As I mentioned before, the impairment of the executive control system occurs even when the individual isn't drunk or high, so that these behaviors persist even when they're not actively using their drug or alcohol. The second part of the brain that's adulterated by repeated substance use is the learning system. This is a system that enables us to adapt to our environment and achieve our goals by learning new information and behaviors. This important brain system also helps us to learn from our mistakes and our successes so that our future actions are improved by lessons learned from the past. Much of the learning that occurs in our brain involves a reward system that releases feel-good chemicals into the brain that give us a bit of a high when we accomplish something good. We learn to repeat behaviors that earn us a reward, and we avoid behaviors that don't result in a reward. As such, much of our learning is reward-based. The learning system involves a number of interconnected circuits, but the part that's primarily affected in addiction is the hippocampus, which is highlighted in red in the diagram here. So, the effects of repeated substance use on the learning system of the brain also produces symptoms that you may recognize in your addicted loved one. For example, they become laser focused on obtaining and using their drugs and alcohol, and nothing else seems to matter. They lose interest in things that were previously important to them, including even looking after their own children, or achieving goals in life that were previously important to them. That's why the addicted mind seems to only care about the here and now. Why they don't seem to care about losing their savings or their house or even their job over their substance use. It's also why you'll typically see addicts spend their rent money or their grocery money on getting drugs today, not seeming to care about what happens in the future. The physical changes that result in the addicted brain are deeply embedded in the fabric of the brain, right down to the molecular level inside neurons. They include changes to how neurons respond to addictive substances, how DNA is expressed in brain cells, how DNA is used by brain cells, how brain cells communicate with each other, and by forming new networks of brain cells, pathways, all of which promote obsessive repeated substance use. The brain essentially becomes physically geared towards substance use as its priority occupation. The good news is that even though these profound changes to brain structure and function occur in the addicted brain, they can be overcome. This is by the process known as neuroplasticity, which is basically the ability of the brain to adapt to changes in what we need it to do. This is the same process by which stroke victims who lose use of an arm can learn to use their arm again with the proper therapy. Part of the explanation for addicts' behavior comes from the effects of substance use on the brain, but much of it also comes from the workings of the addicted mind, in other words, from their psychology. So, what's the difference between the brain and the mind? While the mind comes from the brain is a physical thing, a body organ, and the mind is not. While it's the workings of the brain that somehow produce the mind, unlike the brain, we cannot touch the mind, look at it under a microscope, or see it on imaging scans. Unlike the brain, the mind has no shape or form. The mind is all those things that surround our consciousness and awareness, our creativity and imagination. Just as there is an addicted brain, there's also such thing as the addicted mind. Feelings, perceptions, and self-awareness are affected by addiction, and these in turn adulterate normal thoughts and behaviors to produce many of the symptoms of addiction. Addicts are excellent actors. They lead a double life, going to great lengths to present a false front as if all's well. However, believe me, they're hurting inside, and their mind is consumed by constant invasive thoughts about substance use. They're racked with worry and fear, and they carry tremendous guilt and shame. They present their false front to conceal their problem. They don't want anyone to try to interfere with their drinking or using, and they'll go to great lengths to protect access to their drug. There are a handful of dysfunctional psychological processes that dominate the addicted mind. These are implicated in the progression of substance use to the point of addiction, and they drive much of the odd thinking and behaviors that we see in addicts. Let's look at each of these in turn. First is the dissonant self. This is the terrible feeling of guilt that people feel when their behavior deviates from how they believe that good people should behave. For most of us, when our behavior deviates from how we think people should behave, we correct our behavior and therefore avoid living with guilt. For addicts, this isn't possible because they're unable to stop the substance use and related behaviors, so they continue to live with guilt. This causes considerable psychological discomfort, and it drives them to continue to drink or use to try to smother these negative feelings. Negative psychology. This is a mindset that's dominated by negative feelings and thoughts, such as pessimism, helplessness, self-loathing, and depressed mood. Loss of self-esteem but elevated pride. When addicts' self-esteem is low, the addicted mind tries to compensate by projecting an elevated false pride. This is why addicts are unable to admit when they're wrong. They have to be right in every conversation, and they are unable to admit that they have a problem and need help. Dysfunctional coping. Rather than coping with stress through helping de-stressing approaches such as exercise or recreation, or talking things out with a loved one, or trying to solve the problem causing the stress, the addicted mind turns to avoiding problems and attempting to escape from reality. This is the escape avoidance coping that you may hear talked about. The two ways that they escape and avoid stress and life's realities are through social isolation and substance use. Cognitive bias. This is a proclivity of the mind to fabricate reasons to justify or rationalize behaviors that are harmful and unwise, even if those justifications are obviously untrue. And an external locus of control. This is where people feel like helpless victims of the world, and they come to believe that their fate is determined by outside forces or people, so that there's no point in trying to solve their problems or make their lives better. The study of the addicted mind demonstrates that recovery from addiction is not simply the absence of using drugs or alcohol. Rather, the underlying causes of the addiction and the psychological dysfunction must be addressed and healed, or relapse is almost certain. Until the dissonant self is corrected, the negative psychology is turned positive, self-esteem is restored and fulfilled, healthy coping mechanisms are learned and practiced, and the dysfunctional and harmful thought processes are corrected, the addicted mind will persist, and any abstinence from substance use will be from sheer willpower. And we know how willpower works in the addicted mind. It doesn't. So let's just quickly talk about some of the symptoms that arise from the dysfunctional psychology of the addicted mind, and see if any of these symptoms remind you of the addict in your life. Their behavior has become terrible. They don't understand their behavior and they don't like it any more than you do. But they can't stop it because they can't stop the substance use. Because of this, they live with considerable guilt, self-loathing, and remorse. It also drives down their self-esteem, which the addicted mind tries to compensate for by elevated displays of pride. This is why they act like know-it-alls, and they need to be right in every situation. And they can't admit that they have a problem and might need help. Life has become overwhelming for them. The problems keep piling up at work, at home, and elsewhere in their lives. And they cope by not coping. They shut out the world through social isolation, avoiding people, the world, and all their problems. They also cope with the negative feelings of guilt, self-loathing, and low self-esteem by numbing their mind through continued substance use, and this further propagates the addiction. Their mind isn't working right, so they're able to believe just about anything they want to believe. This is why you'll hear repeated promises that this time they're done with the substance use, but they fail every time, and they continue to make these empty promises. It's also why, in recovery, many will relapse because they believe that enough time has passed that this time they can start drinking or using again, and this time they'll be able to control it. They believe that they're helpless victims of the world, and that there's no point in trying to solve their problems because nothing they could do would make a difference. about half the people who develop addiction will also experience a mental health disorder. The rate is even higher among adolescents, about 60%. In fact, many people who become addicted to substance use get there by self-medicating mental health symptoms. In many cases, they weren't even aware that they had a treatable mental health disorder. They may have lived with the symptoms for so long that it just felt normal for them. So what do I mean by self-medicating mental health symptoms? Well, if someone's experiencing uncomfortable mental health symptoms, such as depression or anxiety, they may find that when they drink or use drugs, that it numbs the discomfort for them. Because of this, they continue returning to the substance use and soon develop an addiction. Conversely, substance use can unmask or even cause mental health disorders, further complicating the addiction and related behaviors. Technically, addiction itself is considered to be a mental health disorder. Addiction and other mental health disorders share a lot of common features, so much so that they overlap and can be difficult to separate from each other when trying to arrive at a diagnosis. Their commonalities include the following: symptoms. As with other mental illnesses, addiction affects people's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, as we've discussed. Repeated substance use causes many of the same symptoms as those that are seen in other mental illnesses, such as depression, anxiety, psychotic disorders, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. There's so much overlap in symptoms that doctors are not supposed to diagnose a mental health disorder in anyone who's involved in substance use, lest a misdiagnosis be made. They cause each other. Self-medicating the symptoms of a mental health disorder with addictive substances is a common cause of repeated substance use and addiction. Conversely, substance use can cause or precipitate mental health disorders. Similar genetics. Many of the same genes that can make people more likely to become substance addicted can also make them more likely to develop a mental health disorder, and vice versa. Similar risk factors. Many of the risk factors for addiction are also risk factors for mental health disorders. And similar brain effects and deficits. Addiction and mental illnesses result from dysfunction in many of the same neurotransmitters, brain pathways, and brain structures. When people suffer from a mental health disorder as well as addiction, both conditions are likely to have a worsened course. For example, compared with either condition occurring alone, concurrent mental health disorders and addiction are associated with more severe psychiatric symptoms, more dramatic adverse effects from substance use, including more blackouts, more physical health symptoms, greater likelihood of financial problems and homelessness, poorer management of personal affairs, more serious relationship problems, including with family, greater likelihood of verbal hostility, disruptive behavior, aggression, and being argumentative, greater likelihood of ending up in jail, lower likelihood of completing treatment or following a treatment plan, increased experiences of social stigma, and increased likelihood of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Many of the behaviors that emerge in addicts may be related to a concurrent mental health disorder. For example, if they're depressed, they may be much more socially isolated and spend long periods of time in bed. Or if they have anxiety or paranoia, they may manifest heightened arousal, suspicion, and fear. It's an absolute must that comorbidity be identified and that both conditions be treated at the same time. The chances of success in recovery depend heavily upon getting it right. It's very difficult to halt substance use in individuals who have an untreated mental illness. Conversely, it's very hard to treat a mental illness when individuals are using psychoactive substances. For clinicians, the symptoms of comorbid mental health disorders and addiction can be so tangled up as to make a diagnosis a challenge. However, the importance of treating both is such that extra care and caution must be taken to avoid missing cases of comorbidity. The high rate of co-occurrence of addiction and mental illness necessitates a high degree of suspicion when one condition is identified. Individuals being treated for substance use should be carefully screened for psychiatric conditions, and vice versa, every time. The diagnosis of mental health illness can be difficult, especially if there's also substance use involved. There are no blood tests or imaging studies to guide the diagnosis. Doctors rely on standardized questionnaires or a description of symptoms. However, even these screening tools are easily confounded by the overlap of symptoms. To make matters worse, people are notoriously reluctant to admit to substance use, as well as mental illness symptoms. In many cases, it's because they fear the social stigma that comes with the diagnosis. So let's get down to brass tacks. How do we use the information we discuss in this video to better help an addicted loved one? Well, in subsequent videos, I'll be giving specific guidance on how to help an addicted loved one in a way that's evidence-based and based on research and experience, and it may be very different from what you've tried in the past. All of the information we'll be discussing is based on the knowledge that we discussed in this video. In video number 2, the next video, we'll be talking about how to talk to and connect with a loved one in addiction, and we'll be using the knowledge we discuss in this video to inform that. In the meantime, I suggest that you consider having some changes about how you think about and approach the problem of addiction, what I refer to as having an attitude change, based on what we discussed in this video. There are 4 points I'd like you to remember. Addiction is a brain disease caused by repeated exposure to addictive substances in vulnerable individuals. Once the brain has reached the addicted state, substance use is no longer a choice. The addicted brain and mind are not capable of normal thought processes, so reasoning, pleading, berating, and bribing addicts to stop their substance use seldom works. The addicted brain and mind can be overcome with the proper therapy in willing individuals, but can be reactivated at any time in the future with renewed substance use. So I'd like to leave you with this take-home message today, and that is, addiction is a matter of biology, not a matter of lack of morals, or lack of willpower, or weakness of character. As we've discussed, addiction occurs because the toxic effects of repeated substance use creates physical changes in the brain that can be documented on imaging scans and under the microscope that create the odd behaviors and thought processes that you are witnessing in your addicted loved one. Even though it seems like your loved one is a whole new person and not a very nice person, one who seems not to care about anything, one who lies and steals, one you can't even talk to anymore. I can assure you that with proper therapy, through neuroplasticity, the addicted brain can be overcome and you can see a return to the same good old person you once knew. In fact, many people who are in recovery from addiction are much more likable and much more functional than they were before because they've had a chance during addiction treatment to deal with some issues that may have been haunting them for some time. The other take-home message I'd like to leave you with today is that we cannot apply our way of thinking to the addicted brain and mind. The addicted brain and mind have been fundamentally altered and don't operate the way ours do. So, to us, it only makes sense. If your substance use is making you miserable and you're losing everything, why don't you just stop? Well, when we try to apply that logic to addicts, it alienates them because it helps them to see that we don't understand what they're going through and what their experience is, and they're less likely to want to talk to us. So, taking an attitude change that we may have to approach them in a different way is an important first step to truly helping an addict become ready to seek and accept help and to enter recovery. And we'll be talking about exactly how to do that in subsequent videos. In the upcoming videos in this series, we're going to talk about how to talk to and connect with a loved one in addiction, how to help a loved one become ready and willing to accept help. We'll talk about what happens in addiction treatment and how you can help. We'll talk about recovery and relapse prevention and how you can help. We'll also talk about how you can stay healthy and sane while helping an addict. We'll talk about boundaries, recovering your peace of mind and happiness, and stepping outside of the addict's circle of chaos so that you're not sacrificing your life for someone else's addiction. If you found my video useful today, please hit the like button below. Also, if you'd like to be notified of my upcoming videos, please subscribe to my channel and click the bell to be notified when a new video comes out. If you'd like to know more about the topics we discussed today, please check out my best-selling book, Understanding and Helping an Addict and Keeping Your Sanity. My book is available on Amazon.com, and if you're interested, I've provided a link in the description below. Thank you.